Edit audio.
This podcast discusses murder and violence against children. Please take care while listening. In the last episode of the Feeney family murders, we learn about Cheryl and a lot about Jon.
And now looking back on it, I realize how inappropriate some of the things were. Thankfully, I think I had enough sense about me, that it was making me not feel good to receive that kind of attention.
And then it quickly became even stranger because as we learned about Jon Feeney, who he was, what his reputation was as a teacher, and it just all became very unsettling.
We learned about Jon's behavior, that who he was outside of the home was completely different from the family man so many knew him to be.
There are so many strange things. It's almost like you're dealing with two people in one,
Last episode, we left off at the funeral of Cheryl, Tyler, and Jennifer Feeney. Family, friends, co-workers, and the police all came to pay their respects. In lieu of flowers, the family asked for donations to help find those responsible for the murder. The day after the funeral, police called Jon Feeney in for questioning. Apparently, this isn't a coincidence. It's not unusual for investigators to wait for a moment of weakness, like a funeral, to call someone in. Jon's sister Deanna told journalist Ron Davis that the relationship between the family and the major case squad deteriorated pretty quickly on that Saturday after the funeral. Jon's family became concerned of his treatment by the public and the media, and that day he hired defense attorney Sean Askinosie. It seemed that this was the pivotal moment when the community turned on Jon Feeney, who just days before seemed to be an innocent victim.
Very quickly it became apparent that Jon Feeney was their suspect. And it quickly became contentious because very quickly Jon hired Sean Askinosie to be his attorney. And it was really Sean's breakout case as a lawyer. And I'd seen him and known him a little bit before, but this was the case that put him on the map.
This is the Feeney Family Murders, an Ozarks true crime story, and I'm your host, Ann Roderick Jones. Ask anyone who knows Sean as a defense attorney, and they'll all say the same thing. He was brilliant.
And Sean was brilliant. And Sean truly did believe that Jon was innocent. He wouldn't have represented him the way that he did otherwise.
Sean was like, holy crap. Sean had a lot of really interesting cases in the 90s. And if you wanted to just do a sidebar on Sean Askinosie, which you should.
I'd first heard about Sean Askinosie during this trial. It was big news in our town. In a matter of days, everyone would know his name and would be talking about this big-time criminal defense attorney.
Jon Feeney retained Sean Askinosie as his defense attorney. And Sean was pretty notorious at that time as being a great defense attorney.
Despite being fairly young, Sean had a sterling record. After graduating law school, he worked in commercial litigation in Dallas for a short time, then eventually moved back to Springfield, where he would practice law for the next 20 years. Rita, the crime scene investigator who we heard from in past episodes, is now a defense lawyer. She clerked for Sean for her first summer out of law school.
Sean was a good attorney. I learned everything I could from Sean. He spent hundreds of hours on his cases. It became very obvious to me very quickly that Sean did not believe that he was guilty. And he would get kind of defensive about it. And since I'm working for him and, hoping to continue working for him, I just kind of let it go.
It seemed as if Sean was one of the few people in town who thought that Jon Feeney was not guilty. Sympathies among others shifted quickly, particularly among Cheryl's friends. Teresa, Cheryl's close friend, remembers seeing Jon at the funeral.
And towards the end of the visitation, I was leaving with some of my work friends, and one of the funeral directors said that Jon said I could stay back if I wanted to. He wanted to talk to me. And of course, I was like, I did not want to talk to him. And he thanked me for being there and told me about the different gifts that he put, in each of the caskets, like a sword or something for Tyler. I just remember standing there thinking that I needed to get out of there. I did not want to be anywhere close to him.
Jackie Shrivner worked at Glendale with Jon and remembers how quickly the school became divided.
There was a little group who said that he was guilty. The majority felt that he was innocent because we hadn't seen anything. The big majority of us couldn't imagine Jon being like that, to do that to his own little children and his wife.
After a couple of weeks of living in a hotel, Jon moves back into his home on Nottingham Street, in the house where the triple homicides took place. Jon would go on to say in an interview that if he gave up the house, he'd be giving up the memories. He drives his wife's car, and he makes detours around the city to avoid places like her work or his son's preschool. He says that he used her shampoo one day so that he could smell her. This doesn't sit well with a lot of people, and I can understand wanting to collect memories from a home that was special to you, but would most people choose to live at the scene of the crime? And how could you even feel safe there after what had been done? When investigating this case for the podcast, 4 of us from the team spent 2 weeks in Springfield. One night, we decided to drive past the old Feeney house. It looks as if someone's living there. There was a car in the driveway, and the lawn was nicely manicured. And on one hand, it felt like a totally normal street in a subdivision. But on the other hand, we all knew what took place there.
I would never have done it. Can't imagine living in a house where my family was murdered by strangers and that you're terrified that they're coming back for you, as he said he was. How do you live in a house like that? You know, who knows? He may have had a hard time with money. I mean, who knows? I'm just saying that the whole idea, if I'm trying to put myself in the place of my family's murdered in my home, I just personally can't imagine ever going back to that house.
He's living in the house, which was another instance where people went, how can you do that? And Feeney's point was, it was our house. Where else am I going to live? Never mind that the house was this crime scene. I don't know how you could go back to a house where your family was wiped out and not walk one step in any direction and realize everything you've lost. Somehow he was able to do that.
I mean, it just proved it more to me. The case squad released the house 2 weeks after the murders. He moves back in. Who moves back into your house when your wife and your 2 young children were murdered? Who can do that? No, I couldn't even drive by the house. I have maybe been by there twice in all these years and had somebody with me because they wanted to see where she lived.
This does seem a bit odd, but I could also imagine that if you had just lost your family, the last thing you'd want to do is look for housing. Meanwhile, journalists were scrambling to get interviews with Jon Feeney in the weeks after the murders. Ron Davis was one of the first journalists to speak with Jon.
We met at Sean Askenosi's office, and I had told Sean for weeks before that, I want to talk to your guy. It's the only way we're going to know what happens. And he was dead set against it right up until the moment we all sat down, and then we talked for 3 or 4 hours. And he seemed to be typical of a man who had lost his family. He didn't seem to be, there was no subterfuge. It didn't appear that he was trying to play a con. He really seemed like he was lost. He would start on a thread about family memory and would just get lost and stop and dissolve, where you realized he was reliving memories of swimming with his daughter, of cooking dinner for his son, of hanging out with the family. And it's really hard, I would think, to fake that because I was asking questions, trying to push emotional buttons, and his emotions appeared to be true.
Do you remember anecdotally, like any stories that he told you or anything that was poignant that happened during some of those interviews?
It was the way that he would talk about how proud he was of his son and how he adored his daughter. He didn't talk much about his wife, other than he admired her, respected her. She was a good worker, a good mom, all those things. That was fairly flat affect, but when it came to his kids, you could tell that he was genuinely lost, or at least he seemed to be genuinely lost.
By this point in the investigation, Jon had now turned over numerous personal and financial records, as well as provided blood and hair samples. He did, however, refuse to take a lie detector test. I wanted to know if this was normal. I reached out to attorney Rod Loomer to get his thoughts. Rod Loomer was a lawyer that Sean brought on to defend Jon Feeney in a civil suit. He told me the people who were administrating the test were the same people who accused Jon Feeney of murder. Rod said that he would never agree to a polygraph exam unless he could select the administrator. So I followed up this question by asking Rod, if someone was innocent, why don't they take the test by a chosen administrator? He said that some people do. However, the mere fact that an accused takes and passes a polygraph exam doesn't mean that the state still won't charge them with a crime, and to keep in mind that passing a polygraph probably won't be admissible. Here's former journalist Robert Keyes.
He had refused a polygraph, I think was one of the first big ones. He wasn't cooperating, was sort of the tone that was coming out of the South Central Missouri Major Case Squad. He just wasn't being as cooperative with them as he needed to be. Again, Sean, he would turn it on law enforcement and say, they didn't even ask. Or how come you didn't let the lawyer in the room when Sean was in there? So he, was very critical of law enforcement at every turn.
A few months after the murders, an unnamed source on the squad would tell reporters that Jon had bought drinks at a downtown bar for 4 or 5 underage females in their late teens who were current or former students. So Jon sues the South Central Missouri Major Case Squad for defamation of his character, for leaking damaging information about him to the media and violating state court rules. But here's the issue. This was a civil case, and evidence of his bad behavior could be brought into court. He then drops the lawsuit.
From my standpoint, it was like, well, but this is what law enforcement's saying. It might mean something. And he did appear to be a prime suspect. I mean, I'm trying to look at every case objectively, but in my mind, it's like, there could be a motive here. And so, again, I'm not trying to solve the case. That's not my job. But I'm just kind of going where the information went. And Sean didn't appreciate it. And he, in fact, was going to sue the South Central Missouri Major Case Squad for releasing information that he felt jeopardized his client's right to a fair trial. And the suit was ultimately dropped. But, Sean didn't like them leaking information to us, which typically it was leaked in the early days. We weren't getting things on the record. We were getting things leaked, and then we tracked it down in other ways. But he wasn't happy with that.
At this point, a lot of people in our town were convinced that Jon did it. I remember that feeling, the divide. Most people who were on Jon Feeney's side received a lot of backlash. Some neighbors were hateful towards Sean, and others admired him. Here's Rod Loomer again.
My daughter was confronted by a classmate and said, "My dad thinks you're stupid for taking this case." And of course, my daughter said, "My dad doesn't care what your dad thinks." And then my wife was at the Y one day, and some lady just, made some comment like, "Does he need money that bad that he's taking this case?" And my other daughter had the best line was, when I asked her, and someone had made some comment to her, and she said, "Does he need a lawyer?" I said, "Well, yeah." And she said, "Well, isn't that what you do?" And then there was an article in the paper. I forgot. It made front page when the suit was filed, and they put my name in there. So you can imagine. I took some, most of my friends did not believe me or that Jon was innocent because they had read the paper and they knew that he had had a background of being unfaithful to his wife, and they were convinced. And some of them to this day, there have been those who I've chatted with that maybe have changed their opinion somewhat. And it was one of those things where I was extremely busy doing other things. I didn't really have the time to do it, but after I read the file, I was convinced I was going to do it.
Though it seemed most people in town thought Jon did it, there was no strong evidence that he did. Rod and Sean both strongly believed he was innocent. As a refresher, let's go back over the timeline of events for this case, starting on the Sunday morning when we can assume that Cheryl and the children had already been murdered. It's Sunday, February 26th. Jon has spoken with Cheryl the previous evening and said that he went to bed with a headache. At 6:59 a.m. on Sunday morning, Jon goes to the McDonald's in Osage Beach. After, he goes golfing. He then attends a science session at the hotel, and he eats lunch in the banquet room and supposedly talks to other guests. At 4 p.m., he leads a session, and when it's over, about 5 p.m., he calls home. There's no answer. Jon is then said to have gotten fast food for dinner and eats it in his hotel room while reading a spy novel. He then attends an I-95 mixer and mingled. After, he and others worked on a presentation that was due the next day at 8 a.m. At 11 p.m. on Sunday night, he calls home again. Still no answer. It's Monday morning, and Jon presents in room C of the resort. After, he's said to have gone back into his room to change into more casual clothes. He missed a call and returned it about 9:30 a.m. on Monday morning. It was a school attendant, and he learns that they can't find Cheryl. Jon calls his parents at 9:47 a.m., and then he calls Greene County and asks for a welfare check on his family. Just after 10 a.m., the sheriff was in his driveway, but when Jon calls the sheriff's office at 10:56, they don't tell him anything. At 11:53, he tries the house again. It's now noon, he's still in Osage Beach, and his friend Steve calls to tell him that he saw his home on the news. At 12:55 in the afternoon, his father calls and the news is delivered that his family is dead. This would be one of Sean's last cases. After the Feeney trial, he sort of disappeared. 2 decades later, I was interning at a food magazine in New York City. I was asked to research a chocolatier from the Ozarks, whose mission it was to make ethical chocolate that directly supports cocoa farmers around the world. Naturally, my ears perked up. This was my hometown. And after digging in, I learned that that major up-and-coming chocolatier was none other than former defense attorney Sean Askinosie. On the next episode of the Feeney family murders, the trial begins and the truth about Jon Feeney comes out.
The thing that made the most sense, ultimately, is that Jon Feeney could have done this because he had motive. You know, he was having affairs. He was doing things that a happily married man and a responsible parent doesn't typically do. And that a teacher who's professional and who adheres to the ethics of his profession doesn't really do. And he was doing those things. Doesn't make him a murderer. But it raises questions, and it's pretty easy, I think, to go to the place where he could have done it because he wasn't the good guy that he was portrayed to be.
Feeney Family Murders is part of the Edit Audio original series Ozarks True Crime. It is written and hosted by me, Ann Roderick Jones. This episode was produced by Ali Sirwa and Kathleen Speckert and was edited, mixed, and mastered by Ali Sirwa. Our executive producer is Steph Colburn. Thank you immensely to the entire Edit Audio team and Patrick Rendell for the theme music. To those who generously shared their time and information with me, thank you. If you want to get in touch with us, you can email us at hello@editaud.io. That's HELLO@EDITAUD.io.